The mahogany conference table in Attorney Morrison's office gleamed under the afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat in the corner chair, wearing a simple black dress and cardigan, watching my family gather around the polished surface like vultures circling a fresh carcass. Dad had been gone for 2 weeks, and the grief in the room was already being overshadowed by anticipatory greed. My brother Carlos adjusted his expensive suit and cleared his throat importantly. At 35, he'd cultivated the appearance of success with his luxury car lease, designer clothes and frequent social media posts from upscale restaurants. He worked as a regional sales manager for a mid-tier software company, making decent money but spending far beyond his means to maintain an image of prosperity. "Before we begin," Carlos announced to the room, "I think we all know how this is going to go. As the eldest son and Dad's business partner, I'm the rightful heir to everything. The construction company, the properties, the investments, they'll all transfer to me as the natural successor." My sister Maria nodded approvingly from across the table. She dressed for the occasion in a black Chanel suit that she'd probably bought specifically for today, anticipating her inheritance windfall. Maria worked as a marketing director for a cosmetics company, earning a comfortable salary that she supplemented with credit card debt to fund her lifestyle in the city's trendy neighborhood. "Carlos has been working with Dad on the business for years," Maria added, shooting me a dismissive glance. "It only makes sense that he'd inherit the family assets. Some of us have been building careers while others have been." She gestured vaguely in my direction. "Well, doing whatever it is you do, Isabella." Uncle Roberto and Aunt Carmen murmured their agreement. They'd driven down from Sacramento for the reading, already making plans for how Carlos would manage the family construction business that Dad had built over 30 years. The company specialized in commercial projects, office buildings, retail centers, apartment complexes, and had generated steady income for decades. "Rodriguez Construction has been in the family for 3 generations, Uncle Roberto said proudly. "It's only right that it stays with the son who understands the business." I remained silent in my corner, smoothing down my simple dress and listening to my family discuss my father's legacy as if I weren't in the room. They saw what they'd always seen: the youngest daughter who'd never married, never had children, never achieved the traditional markers of success that mattered to them. At 32, I lived in a modest apartment, drove a reliable but unremarkable Toyota, and worked what they assumed was some kind of low-level office job that I rarely discussed. What they didn't know was that I'd been quietly managing more of Dad's affairs than anyone realized. Attorney Morrison entered the room carrying a thick leather portfolio and a grave expression. He'd been the family lawyer for over 20 years, handling everything from Dad's business contracts to Maria's divorce proceedings. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and the kind of precise demeanor that comes from decades of delivering life-changing news to families in crisis. "Thank you all for coming," Morrison said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time, and I'll try to make this process as straightforward as possible." Carlos leaned forward eagerly. "We appreciate that, Mr. Morrison. I think we're all prepared for what's coming. Dad and I discussed his wishes many times over the years." "Indeed," Morrison replied carefully. "Your father was very thorough in his estate planning. However, there are some elements of his arrangements that may surprise you." He opened the portfolio and removed several documents, arranging them methodically on the table. "Let me begin with the family construction business, Rodriguez Construction LLC." "That comes to me obviously," Carlos interrupted. "I've been Dad's partner for the past 8 years. I know every contract, every client relationship, every aspect of the operation." Morrison looked at Carlos with the patient expression of someone who'd dealt with presumptuous heirs before. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm afraid that's not accurate. Rodriguez Construction was transferred to Isabella Rodriguez 3 years ago, along with all associated assets, properties and contractual obligations." The room fell completely silent. Carlos blinked rapidly as if he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Your sister Isabella has been the sole owner and operator of Rodriguez Construction since January 2021, when she assumed all business debts and obligations in exchange for full ownership transfer." Maria's mouth dropped open. "That's impossible. Isabella doesn't know anything about construction. She works some little office job downtown." "Actually," Morrison continued, consulting his documents, "Ms. Rodriguez has been managing the company's operations, client relationships and financial obligations for the past 3 years. Under her leadership, the company has expanded significantly, taking on larger projects and increasing annual revenue by approximately 340%. I finally spoke up from my corner. The little office job is overseeing 12 construction crews, managing $47 million in active contracts and coordinating projects across 3 counties. My family stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. But how? Carlos stammered. I've been going to the office every day, meeting with clients, supervising projects. You've been handling day-to-day operational tasks as a site manager, I said gently. I've been running the business. The client meetings you've attended? I arranged them. The projects you've supervised? I negotiated the contracts. The paychecks you've received? I've been signing them. Morrison nodded. Ms. Rodriguez has been the company's CEO and primary decision-maker for 3 years. Your father made this arrangement when the business faced significant financial difficulties, and Isabella stepped in to prevent bankruptcy. Uncle Roberto was shaking his head in disbelief. This doesn't make sense. Isabella's never shown any interest in the construction business. She barely comes to family gatherings. I've been working 60-hour weeks for the past 3 years, I replied. Family gatherings became a luxury I couldn't afford while I was rebuilding the company Dad nearly lost. Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps I should explain the circumstances that led to this arrangement. In late 2020, Rodriguez Construction was facing severe financial difficulties. Several large clients had defaulted on payments. The company owed approximately $2.3 million to suppliers and subcontractors, and there were pending lawsuits that threatened to force bankruptcy. Carlos looked pale. I knew we had some cash flow problems, but I didn't realize. Your father was protecting you from the full extent of the crisis, Morrison continued. He didn't want to burden you with problems he felt responsible for creating. Instead, he approached Isabella, who had been quietly observing the business's challenges and had developed a comprehensive recovery plan. Recovery plan? Maria echoed. Isabella doesn't have business training. She doesn't have access to millions of dollars. How could she possibly save a failing construction company? Morrison smiled slightly. As it turns out, Ms. Rodriguez had both the expertise and the resources necessary to turn the company around. She'd been working as a senior project manager for Meridian Development Group, one of the largest commercial real estate firms on the West Coast. I watched my family's faces as they processed this information. They'd assumed my reluctance to discuss work in detail meant I had an unimpressive job, when in reality I'd been protecting client confidentiality and managing projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Meridian Development? Uncle Roberto repeated. They handle some of the biggest construction projects in the state. They do, I confirmed. I'd been working there for 6 years, managing everything from shopping center developments to high-rise office buildings. When Dad's company got into trouble, I had the industry connections and financial resources to step in. Morrison consulted another document. Ms. Rodriguez used her personal savings and investment portfolio to pay off all company debts, totaling $2.3 million. In exchange, your father transferred complete ownership of Rodriguez Construction to her, along with all properties, equipment, and future earnings. Investment portfolio? Carlos asked weakly. I'd been investing systematically since college, I explained. Living below my means, putting money into diversified accounts, building wealth quietly while everyone assumed I was struggling financially. Morrison nodded. The arrangement has proven extremely beneficial for all parties. Ms. Rodriguez transformed Rodriguez Construction from a failing local business into one of the region's most successful commercial contractors. Current annual revenue exceeds $23 million, with projects scheduled through 2026. Maria was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. Isabella, you're saying you've been running a multi-million-dollar construction company for 3 years and we had no idea? You had no idea because you never asked what I was actually doing, I replied. You saw that I lived modestly and worked long hours, and you assumed that meant I was unsuccessful. But why didn't Dad tell us? Carlos demanded. Why let me think I was going to inherit the business when you'd already taken it over? Morrison looked uncomfortable. Your father struggled with that decision. He was proud of Isabella's success but worried about family dynamics. He hoped that over time the situation would become apparent naturally. He was protecting your feelings, I added. Dad knew you'd invested your identity in being his business successor. He didn't want to hurt you by making the transition public until it was absolutely necessary. Aunt Carmen had been silent throughout the revelations, but now she spoke up. Isabella, if you own the construction company, what happens to the rest of us? Carlos has been depending on his salary and we all expected. Everyone who's been working for the company will continue working for the company, I said. Carlos, your position is secure, and your salary will actually increase now that we're more profitable. The only thing that changes is official recognition of what's been true for 3 years. Morrison continued with the rest of the will reading. Dad's personal assets, his house, his car, his savings accounts, were divided among his children according to a traditional structure. But the business, which represented the bulk of his wealth, had already been transferred years earlier. There's one more element to discuss, Morrison said, removing a sealed envelope from his portfolio. Your father left individual letters for each of you, to be opened after the will reading. He handed me mine and I opened it with trembling fingers. My dearest Isabella, Dad had written in his careful handwriting. By now you know that everyone understands what you've accomplished. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to tell them sooner. You saved our family's legacy, and you did it with grace and humility that made me proud every day. I know Carlos and Maria will be shocked, but I hope they'll also be grateful. You've given them security they wouldn't have had otherwise. Take care of our family business, but more importantly, take care of our family. Love, Papa. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter carefully. Carlos was reading his own letter, his expressions cycling through confusion, understanding, and something that looked like relief. Dad says he was worried about my reaction, but that he hoped I'd be proud to work for my brilliant sister. Maria's letter apparently contained similar sentiments, because she was looking at me with new eyes. Isabella, I owe you an apology. We've been treating you like the family failure when you were actually the one holding everything together. You weren't trying to hurt me, I said. You were working with incomplete information. But why did you let us think you were struggling? Carlos asked. Why not tell us what you were really doing? Because the business recovery required my complete focus, I explained. I couldn't afford to spend time managing family expectations or dealing with questions about decisions I needed to make quickly. Your assumptions about my situation gave me the freedom to work without interference. Uncle Roberto was shaking his head slowly. Isabella, how much is the company worth now? Based on current contracts and projected earnings, approximately $15 million. I said. We're also in negotiations for several major projects that could increase that valuation significantly. $15 million, Maria repeated faintly. And you built that while we thought you were barely getting by. Morrison began packing up his documents. If there are no further questions about the estate arrangements, I think we've covered everything. Isabella, you'll need to sign some additional paperwork to formalize the transition from your father's name to yours on certain accounts. But the substantive work was completed years ago. As the family began to file out of the conference room, Carlos approached me hesitantly. Isabella, I need to ask you something. When I've been working on projects, giving directions to crews, making decisions about materials and schedules, was I actually in charge, or were you managing everything behind the scenes? You were in charge of day-to-day operations, I said diplomatically. But yes, I was making the strategic decisions, approving major expenditures and handling client relationships. You're good at what you do, Carlos. You just weren't doing what you thought you were doing. He laughed, but it sounded more relieved than bitter. So I've been a middle manager who thought he was a CEO. You've been a valuable employee who helped save the family business, I corrected. There's no shame in that. Maria joined our conversation. Isabella, I have to ask. How does it feel to know that we've been patronizing you for years while you were secretly more successful than any of us? I considered the question carefully. It feels like justice, but not the vindictive kind. It feels like truth finally being acknowledged. And what happens now? Carlos asked. Now we move forward as a family that actually knows each other, I said. You can keep doing the work you're good at, but with better understanding of how your role fits into the bigger picture. Maria, your marketing experience could actually be valuable for expanding our client base. And Uncle Roberto, your connections in Sacramento could help us bid on state projects. 6 months later, I was standing in the conference room of our new corporate headquarters, looking out at the bustling construction site where our crews were building a 12-story office complex. Rodriguez Construction had officially rebranded as Rodriguez Development Group, reflecting our expansion into full-service commercial real estate development. Carlos had embraced his role as operations manager, and his performance had improved dramatically once he understood the company's actual scope and his place within it. Maria had taken a part-time consulting position with us, helping develop marketing strategies for attracting higher-value clients. Even Uncle Roberto had become involved, using his Sacramento connections to secure 3 significant state contracts. My phone buzzed with a text from Carlos. Just closed the Riverside project. $3.2 million contract, 18-month timeline. Thanks for teaching me how to negotiate properly. I smiled and replied, thanks for being willing to learn. The family that had once dismissed me as the unsuccessful younger sister now understood that I'd been quietly building something extraordinary while they'd focused on appearances and assumptions. More importantly, they'd moved beyond their initial shock to become genuinely supportive of what we were accomplishing together. That evening we held our monthly family dinner at the restaurant where we'd gathered after Dad's funeral. The atmosphere was completely different now. Instead of patronizing concern for my future, there was genuine interest in the business developments and mutual respect for each other's contributions. Isabella, Aunt Carmen said as we looked over the dessert menu, I need to apologize for all those years of treating you like you needed our guidance and protection. You were trying to be helpful based on what you could see, I replied. I don't hold that against anyone. But we were so wrong about everything, Maria said. We thought you were the one who needed help when you were actually the one helping all of us. Carlos raised his wine glass. To Isabella, who saved our family's legacy while we were too busy making assumptions to notice what she was actually accomplishing. To family, I replied, and to the difference between what we think we see and what's actually happening. My family had spent years telling me what my future should look like, never bothering to discover what I was building in the present. Now they knew the difference between assumptions and reality. And so did I.